This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for inviting me and welcoming me to Melbourne. I want to thank my good friend Rabbi Widmont for arranging this leg of the trip to Melbourne, and thank you for your very warm hospitality and all the efforts you put in arranging it and sponsoring it from the Rimon Advisory. And we have over here on the line my good Yedid, Rabbi Glatstein. You're there? Hello? He's there. He's just being modest. Okay? And Rishus Rabbi Berlin and Rabbi Hanan. And thank you very much, Rabbi Berlin, for hosting it in your shul. And Mitzvah Hashem, your shul should continue to grow and be Marbetz Torah and be a makam of Torah Tefillah and be Asgal Tzedek. Okay, so I got very strict instructions to give a shiur lamdash sugya. So I was thinking either of doing the lamdus of Yud Zayin Av, which I don't know of any lamdus on Yud Zayin Av, but the closest thing I thought to speak about perhaps is the lamdus of the mitzvah of Shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So let's begin with the comments of the Smag, of Moshe Mikusi, one of the great Rishonim. In fact, if you look in Tosfos in Masechta Yuma, the Tosfos Yeshanim, Masechta Sukkah was written by Rav Moshe Mikusi, the Smag. And the Smag wrote a Sefer HaMitzvos, and in Mitzvah Mem Beis he says, Mitzvah saseh litkoya b'shofar b'Rosh Hashanah. There's a positive commandment to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Likewise, the Shiltos of Rabbi Chai Goin, one of the Goinim. By the way, the Shiltos Bechlau was a trailblazer, and it was a very novel concept. You see, before the Shiltos, you were either a parshan on the Chumash, or you're a codifier of halacha, like the Rambam, like the Torah. But to write halacha on the parsha, nobody ever did before. Nowadays, it's like standard. It's like a common thing. You write halachas on the parsha. But the Shiltos was really the one who invented the concept of writing halachas on the parsha. And why did he do that? If you look in the Hakdam of the Meiri writes that the Shiltos Rabbi Chaya Goin had a son. And his son was loy hoya loy made klal. His son did not learn at all. And he needed to come up with a mahalach to get his son to learn. So he wrote halachos on the parsha. That was like an interesting way to do it. You know, sometimes in chinuch people say, you know, we can't do it this way, we never did it this way, we have a Masorah to do it. The Masorah is you do what works. That's the Masorah. That's what we learned from Rabbi Chai Goin. He changed it because the typical standard way, the system wasn't working for his kid. Okay, and anyway, the Shiltos writes in Mitzvah Kuf Ayin Aleph, the Mechayvin, the Beis Yisrael, Lemiska, B'chatzoitzra, B'chad V'tishrei. The mitzvah is to blow the Chatzoitzros, which is the equivalent of the Shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Fine. That means he's defining that the mitzvah is what? To blow the Shofar. Well, if the mitzvah is to blow the Shofar, what bracha do you make? So the Shilta says, U'mevarech, Baruch Atah Hashem l'chein melchaylam, Asher Kedushan B'tzoisav, L'tkoya b'Shofar. The bracha is, Baruch Atah Asher Kedushan B'tzoisav, V'tzivanu, L'tkoya b'Shofar. Right? That's the bracha, of course. Likewise, the Rosh quotes Rabbeinu Tam that we make the bracha al tikiyas shofar. So you say, of course, obviously the mitzvah is to blow the shofar. That's what we do. That's what Jews do on Rosh Hashanah. We blow the shofar. However, the Rambam could not write in more places that there is no mitzvah in the Torah to blow the shofar. In fact, the Rambam writes in 8 places. I once saw in a sefer Yom HaZikaron of Rabbi Yonasan Sachs, not to be confused with the former chief rabbi. He's a Rosh Yeshiva in Landers College, of Beis Medrash LaTalmud, I think it's called. And he's a Rav Agudas Yisrael in Passaic. He wrote a sefer Yom HaZikaron, and he writes that in 7 places, the Rambam writes, the mitzvah on Rosh Hashanah is not to blow the shofar, but rather to listen to the shofar. My humble addition is I found an 8th place where the Rambam writes this. So he found 7 of them. I found one obscure place where the Rambam writes, first of all, in the beginning of Hilchos Shofar, the heading of the Hilchos Shofar, the Koiseres of the Rambam, in number 4, the Rambam writes, L'shmoya ko shofar becha b'tishrei. Not to blow the shofar, but rather to listen to the shofar. Likewise, in Halacha Aleph, the Rambam says, Mitzvah saseh, L'shmoya truas hashofar. And mitzvah to listen Then now you'll say, what's the nafkamina, whether the mitzvah is to blow or the mitzvah is to listen? It makes a very big nafkamina halacha. Because what's the halacha if you steal a pair of tefillin and you wear it? Are you yotzei the mitzvah or you're not yotzei the mitzvah? La yatsa, why? Mitzvah haba ba'avera. You steal a talis, you put it on. You're yotzei, you're not yotzei. You steal a sukkah, you're yotzei, you're not yotzei. And yet the halacha is, if you steal a shofar and you blow it, and you hear the sound of the shofar, you're yotzei. Why? You steal tefillin, you're not yotzei. You steal talis, you're not yotzei. You steal shofar, the Rambam paskins you're yotzei. You know why? Says the Rambam, there's no mitzvah in the Torah to blow the shofar. The mitzvah is to hear the sound of the shofar. The chefza shel mitzvah is not the horn. The chefza shel mitzvah is the sound. The horn is just a tool. Everybody would agree if you steal a hammer and you build a sukkah, you're yotzei by sitting in that sukkah. Likewise, the Rambam paskins that if you steal a shofar and you hear the sound of that shofar, you're yotzei. Says the Rambam, shofar hagazo shetaka ba yatsa she'ein hamitzvah ela b'shmias hakoel afal pi shaloi nagaba. The sound, the mitzvah is to hear the shofar. The Rambam continues, Parak Beis, number 7. Hakol chayavin l'shmoya kol shofar. The Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvahs writes, the 170th mitzvah is shetzivanu l'shmoya kol shofar. The Rambam, who's in his summary of the mitzvahs, again writes, l'shmoya kol shofar. The one that I found is, the Rambam, at the end of the Sefer HaMitzvahs, has the mitzvahs that there's no way out of. Mitzvahs hechrechiyos, where the Rambam writes, one of them is, in other words, some mitzvahs you don't have to do. Let's say shiluach hakein, you don't have to do it. You only have to do it if you see it. If you don't see it, you don't have to do it. But there's certain mitzvahs, there's no way out of, and one of them is, the Rambam says, to hear the sound of the shofar. And then famously, the Rambam in his Tshuvos in the Pe'er Adar, Siman on Aleph, the Rambam writes, discussing is the mitzvah to blow or is the mitzvah to hear. The Rambam says there's a very big nafkamina. If the mitzvah would be to blow, if you blew the shofar and you stuck your fingers in your ears, you would be yotzei. If you blew the shofar in a pit and you couldn't hear a thing, you would be yotzei. And yet we know the halacha is, if you blow the shofar and you don't hear it, you're not yotzei. We also know, says the Rambam, if the mitzvah was to blow the shofar, how many people in the shul would be yotzei the mitzvah? Only one person. Because you can't put on tefillin for me, you can't sit in a sukkah for me, you shouldn't be able to blow a shofar for me. So if the mitzvah was to blow, only the tokeah would be yotzei. If the mitzvah was to blow, you would be yotzei if you blow in a pit or if you stick your fingers in your ears. But now that the mitzvah is to listen, everyone in the shul is yotzei. Now that the mitzvah is to listen, if you stick your fingers in your ears, you are not yotzei. Based on the Rambam, there's a very interesting and beautiful tshuva in the Avnei Nezer. The Sachet Shavar Rebbe says a beautiful idea. In every shul, as far as I know, the minna, any bali toikeya here? Any people blow the shofar here? I could tell you're the kind of person who blows the shofar. By the fact that he's pointing at you, that indicates, yeah. So the minhag of the bali toikeya is, when they make the bracha on the shofar is covered. Which seems to be keneged the halacha. Because we know the halacha is kol ha-brachos mevarich oisan oiver la'asiyasan, right? Kol ha-mitzvos mevarich olam oiver la'asiyasan, which means you have to make the bracha immediately prior to the performance of the mitzvah. That's why we don't make the bracha when the tefillin is in the bag. We don't make the bracha when we're about to put it on our arm. We put it on the arm, and as we're about to be kosher, right before the kshira, we make the bracha. You don't make a bracha when the talis is in the bag. You make the bracha right before the atifa. In fact, Avnei Nezer quotes the Ran. The Ran wants to know, why is there no bracha on Kiddushay Bia? So the Ran says, because it would have to be prior to the performance, and that would be at a time when you're not able to make a bracha. So make it earlier. No, you could only make a bracha over l'asiyasan. Meaning, any time you're forced to make a bracha before the immediate performance of the mitzvah, you can't even make the bracha. And therefore the Avnei Nezer asks, by covering the shofar, you're delaying the performance of the mitzvah. Wouldn't it be better to hold up the shofar right next to your mouth, and then you make the bracha, and the second you finish the bracha, you would blow the shofar? Why would we delay the performance of the mitzvah by covering the shofar? So Avnei Nezer says a very beautiful idea. He says, the same way we cover the challah. Why do we cover the challah Friday night? Because technically you can make kiddush on the challah. So when you're making kiddush on the yayin, it's embarrassing to the challah that you've rejected the challah to make the bracha on the yayin. Likewise, the shofar is very insulted. Because when the shofar hears the bracha, l'shmoya kol shofar, the shofar has now been relegated to a second-class citizen. It thought you might say like the Rosh or the Shiltis, and then the shofar would have been elevated to the category of Chefza Shel Mitzvah. But now that we're saying the mitzvah is l'shmoya, and the shofar is not a Chefza Shel Mitzvah, it's only a tool, it's embarrassing for the shofar to have to hear the bracha on it. So we cover it so the shofar should not hear us insult the shofar by saying l'shmoya kol shofar. Likewise, by the way, the Rosh brings the Ravya that the bracha on the shofar is not like Rabbeinu Tam and the Shiltus, Litkaya, but rather the bracha is l'shmoya. And the Bahag also says the bracha on the shofar is l'shmoya. Okay, so what we're going to, the first question on the table tonight is, this is a very wide machlokes. Is the bracha, is the mitzvah to blow, or is the mitzvah to listen? That's a very wide machlokes. We like to, when there's a machlokes rishon, we try to make it as close as possible. We try to make it that they're only arguing on a very nuanced point. Not that one shita holds there's a mitzvah to blow, and the other shita holds there's a mitzvah to listen. That's a very wide machlokes. Okay, it's not the end of the world. But as we're going to see, by examining a number of Gemaras, it's going to really box us in to a very, very limited understanding of the mitzvah of shofar. Let's start as follows. We mentioned earlier from the Mishnah on Rosh Hashanah, if somebody blows the shofar and he in a pit and he doesn't hear the sound of the shofar, are you yotzei or are you not yotzei? You're not yotzei. If somebody blows the shofar and he doesn't hear the shofar, you're not yotzei. So that seems to indicate that the mitzvah is not to blow, but the mitzvah is to listen. If the mitzvah was to blow, you should be yotzei even if you didn't hear. So to that, the Maharam El Shakar in a tshuva says, nah, that's not conclusive. The fact that you need to hear the sound of the shofar does not mean the mitzvah is to listen. It could be the mitzvah is to blow. Why is the halacha that if you blow and you didn't listen, you're not yotzei? He says, like Kriya Shema. Is the mitzvah to listen to Shema, or is the mitzvah to say Shema? The mitzvah is to say Shema. And what if you said it? Don't you have to say it loud enough for your ear to hear? Why do I have to say it loud enough for my ear to hear? The mitzvah is the Kriya. If the mitzvah is the Kriya, why do I need Shmiya? So it must be that even sometimes when the mitzvah is to say, you also need the participation of the ear. There's still a requirement that the ear has to participate. Likewise, you can make the case that really the mitzvah is to blow the shofar. Why do you need to listen? Because you also need the participation of the ear, the same way by Kriya Shema. Karav, Lo Shama. Now, the Maharam El Shakar admits it's not a perfect analogy, because by Kriya Shema, if you're Kare and Lo Shama, you're still Yotzei B'di'eved. And by Shofar, if you blew and you didn't hear, you're not even Yotzei B'di'eved. But that's the analogy the Maharam El Shakar gives, that it's like Kriya Shema, so it could be the mitzvahs to blow. Why do you need to hear? You need the participation of the ear. Let's take it next step. You ready? There's another Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, number 15. Cheresh shoita v'katan. A deaf person, an imbecile, a minor, ein moitziin es harabim midei chayvasan. Cannot be moitzi the tzibor der chiyav. Zeh klal. In order to be a Baal Tekeah, you have to be Campus Mentis, you have to be a Baal Seichel, you cannot be a Cheresh, you cannot be a Shoita, you cannot be a Katan, you cannot be a Goy, you cannot be an Isha, you have to be somebody who's Mechuyev in the Mitzvah. So the question is, if the Mitzvah of the Shofar is to blow the Shofar, and the Baal Tekeah is being Moitzimi in that Maisa Mitzvah, so understand why the Baal Tekeah has to be a Bar Chiyuva, cannot be a Cheresh, cannot be a Shoita, cannot be a Katan. But if the mitzvah of Shofar is to listen to the sound of the Shofar, and blowing the Shofar then is only a Hechsher mitzvah, why in the world can't the Baal Tekeah be a Cheresh, Shoita, Katan? Haga ba'atzmecha. If a Cheresh builds a sukkah, could you sit in the sukkah? Yes. If a Shoita builds a sukkah, could you sit in the sukkah? Yes. Why? Because they're not being moitzi you in anything. The cherish is not being moitzi you in sukkah. There's no mitzvah to build a sukkah. There's no mitzvah in the Torah to build a sukkah. It's even a question. So why don't you just hire someone else? Is there an Inyan even to build a sukkah? Maybe there's an Inyan. Actually, the Netziv has in his commentary to the Shiltas, it's called Hechsher Mitzvah Haksuva B'Kra. Meaning, did you ever hear, today the shul is going on a field trip, it's a week before Rosh Hashanah, we're all going out to drill shofaros. Do you know like Rabbanim who go to drill out the shofar Erev Rosh Hashanah? Nobody does that. So why are people going to bake matzahs? There's a mitzvah in the Torah to bake matzahs? There's no mitzvah in the Torah to bake matzahs. So why do we bake matzahs and we don't drill shofaros? So the Netziv has a chiddush that when a hechsher mitzvah that's mentioned in the Torah is elevated and there's an inyan to do it yourself and not have someone else do it for you. Baking matzah is mentioned in the Torah. It's not a mitzvah. There's no mitzvah in the Torah to bake matzah. Building a sukkah is mentioned in the Torah. There's no mitzvah in the Torah to build a sukkah. The halacha is, if a guy builds a sukkah, are you yotzei? Avad, it's b'ferish gemara. Sukkah is ganvach. You're yotzei. So the question is, if the mitzvah is to listen to the sound of the shofar, then why can't a guy blow the shofar? A guy could build your sukkah. Okay, that's what the Gemara says. There might be a halach in the Ramah. There's a side reason maybe a guy doesn't build a sukkah. But make her a din, a guy could build a sukkah. So if a guy is allowed to build a sukkah, why can't he blow shofar for you? I understand if the mitzvah is to blow, the guy can't blow for you. But if the mitzvah is to listen, so then the blowing of the shofar is analogous to the building of the sukkah. Why could a guy build a sukkah and not blow the shofar? This is like the arm is starting to twist. In other words, if the mitzvah is to listen to the sound of the shofar, bishlama, according to the Shiltas and the Bahag and the Smag, that the mitzvah is to blow, so the guy can't blow. But if the Rambam is correct that the mitzvah is to listen to the sound of the shofar, why can't a cheresh shaytu v'katan blow for you? So the Shagas Aryeh says, it's a raya from the Mishnah. Now clearly the mitzvah is to listen, because it says if you blow and you didn't hear, you're not yotzei. But the Shagas Aryeh says, from here we see that the mitzvah of shofar is different than any other mitzvah in the Torah. There are two parts of the mitzvah. You have to blow, and you have to listen. How do we know you have to blow? Because a cheresh shaytu v'katan can't blow for you. That means part of the mitzvah is blowing. But we know you have to listen, because if you didn't hear the sound, you're not yotzei. So the Shagas Aryeh says a whopper of a chiddush that nobody agrees to, and it's very difficult to say, that there's one mitzvah in the Torah that has two parts to it. What is it? Tkiyah shofar. You gotta blow and you gotta listen. Here you have a guy, he has ADHD. I don't know if that came to Australia yet, but in America, it's mamish, it's a machla, it's spread, it's all over the place. It's here, shining. People say, no, I blew, I can't do anything else, I have to do another thing. We say, yeah, you have to do another thing, you need to listen. But the good news is that the second part of the mitzvah comes pretty quickly after the first part.
Isn't that instantaneous, basically?
It is instantaneous, I'm joking. Meaning you have to do two things. It happens to be, the good news is that both things happen exactly at the same time.
Your whole mitzvah sichas kavanah, how can you have kavanah for both at the same time?
I'm going to get to that. You're mechavin to do two parts of the mitzvah.
You can't hold two thoughts in your head at the same time if they're two separate mitzvahs.
Mitzvah sichas kavanah anyway, you're mechavin before. So I'm mechavin before to be mekayim the mitzvah of shofar, which is dahainu, tekiyah u'shmiyah. That's what the Shagas Aryeh learns, that there are two parts of the mitzvah. Now, is that what the Rambam holds? The Rambam holds there are two parts of the mitzvah. The Rambam says 1,000,000 times the mitzvah is to listen. Clearly the Rambam cannot hold like the Shagas Aryeh, because the Rambam paskins if you steal a shofar, you're yotzei. Why in the world would be yotzei? If part of the mitzvah is blowing, you blew with a chefta shel mitzvah, which is stolen. The Rambam clearly does not agree to the Shagas Aryeh. But that's how the Shagas Aryeh learns the mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to blow, there's a mitzvah to listen.
The Rambam will agree that there's a concept of hechsher mitzvah, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need a shofar. Recording probably would work.
Correct.
So a cheresh shaytu v'katan blowing the shofar. Perhaps you have a problem of the hechsher mitzvah not working. So,
okay, good point. But let's if the mitzvah is to listen, then the blowing of the shofar is like building the sukkah. Now, a cheresh shaytu v'katan could build a sukkah. So why couldn't the Cheresh Shad V'Katan blow the shofar?
And why couldn't you hear it from the recording?
That's not the sound of a shofar.
If the recording is done well, it's the sound of
It's still, it's electric, it's the real sound is transformed into electrical impulses, which are reconstituted to mimic the sound of the shofar. Okay, maybe you're saying, we're going to come to a similar idea. But for right now, if the mitzvah is to listen to the sound of the shofar, then blowing the shofar is very analogous to the building of the sukkah.
Blowing.
Yeah, but
hear a certain type of blowing. Mitzvah to listen to a certain blowing has to be a.
The Torah says to blow, but the Rambam is saying, but there's no mitzvah to blow. The mitzvah is to hear.
Yeah, but the mitzvah is to hear.
By the way, Tiku B'Chodesh the shofar is a pasuk in Tehillim.
It's a different pasuk. It's Yom Shur Yelachem.
Trua, it's the other way around.
It's a day of Trua. But what do we do with the Trua? Do we blow it or do we hear it? The Rambam says it's a mitzvah to hear it.
But a Cheresh can't hear his own blowing, so he can't be mighty other people because he can't be mighty the mitzvah at all.
Why can't a guy build a sukkah? A guy can't be yaitz.
A guy could build a sukkah for you, so why can't he build a shofar for you?
But I mean, he has to be.
He's not being mighty you in anything. The guy who builds
himself.
He doesn't have to be mighty himself. A hammer.
He doesn't have to be mighty himself.
He's just He's just creating the sound. I'm going along and I'm chapping the sound with my ear. I'm doing everything.
And he can say the bracha on the mitzvah. He can say a bracha on the mitzvah. He's not.
The cheresh. We're not talking about the bracha right now. We're talking about the bracha is not ma'akev. The Mishnah says a cheresh cannot blow the shofar for you. Okay, so we're going to go to the Chazon Ish. So Chazon Ish says a svara. Maybe this is what you're trying to say. Number 19. That avada, the mitzvah is to hear the sound of the shofar. But you need to hear a halachic sound. You can't just hear, like Rabbi Hanan said, a recording. So the same way you can't hear a recording, you can't hear a sound which is not the sound of a mitzvah. And if a cheresh shoita v'katan blows the shofar, that's not a halachic sound. It's not enough to hear a noise. You can't hear a noise. Let's say, I don't know, it was in Sydney, they have these parrots there. Let's say a parrot mimics the sound of a shofar, and you test it on a machine, and it's the exact same decibel, and it's exact that you're going to say because it has to come from a shofar. It has to be produced by a yid who's a bar chiyuva. If the yid is not a bar chiyuva, that's not a halachic sound. By a sukkah, the sukkah is just the building, so anyone can make it, even if they're not a bar chiyuva. But a sound is not like a physical entity. It's a halachic entity. It's not a mitzvah to hear a noise. It's a mitzvah to hear a halachic noise. A halachic noise has to be created by one who's able to create that halachic noise. Who is a bar chiyuva? Not so posh. It's not so clear. It's a very big chiddush. But I could hear such a thing. But here's the big problem. Huh? The levush? I didn't say the levush because it cannot be explained. It's very sure. We could do it, The levush says that how could you be yotze from a sound since Hashem doesn't want that sound? How could be motzi others? What's that supposed to mean? Hashem doesn't want the sound. How can you motzi others? He's not being motzi anybody in anything. When you build a sukkah, you know why a guy could build a sukkah? Because he's not being moitzi anybody. So why in the world can't a guy produce a sound? Hashem, you can't be moitzi somebody in a sound that Hashem doesn't want. You're not being moitzi anybody. I'm listening. I'm doing everything.
Could mean the same thing as a chazan.
Yeah, you could be chaylev. The sukkah is not a mitzvah. Because he didn't build 6 months ago. Say he wasn't Yosha, whatever. He built whatever. So if you go in, you have to go to kosher place. Here, in order to listen, it has to be the Maisa now of it's much more connected to the mitzvah.
That's a chazanish's.
Yeah, but you know what he's saying. It's the mitzvah's being done now. So if you can't do the mitzvah now,
right,
then how can you? It's much more. It's not chazanish, but it's much more closely related than a sukkah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure what he's saying because he's saying how could you be moitzi somebody, But in the world of the Rambam, the Tokeya is not being moitzi anybody in anything. Right? According to the Rambam, the Baal Tokeya is nothing. But, right? The Baal Tokeya is the guy with a hammer building a sukkah. He's not being moitzi anymore. What does he even mean? The Kivan Shein Hashem Yizvach Chafetz Ba'atzmai Hech Yoitzi Achim. He's not being moitzi Achim.
But there is a bit of the difference because about the case might himself as well.
I would say he's not even being moitzi himself. The mitzvah is listening.
Yeah,
He happens,
he's listening to himself.
but he's not being moitzi himself.
Doesn't have to. It's different
Yes,
point.
he's like a guy. What if he's like a guy? A guy knowledge.
Okay, so but we could hear a little bit that in order to produce a halachically kosher sound, you have to be someone who's mechuyev in the mitzvah. But here's where it gets very tricky, and it almost becomes impossible. Let's say a guy walks into the shul, Rosh Hashanah morning, and he has this itch on his lip, and the only way he could scratch himself is if he blows, a few tkiyas and a few truas and a few shvarim, and that's gonna release his inner itch. He's misasek. He comes into the shul, and he's so itchy, and he just blows out 100 tkiyas. And the oilam happened to be there. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he happened to be. Everyone was there at the right time, right before Musaf. He's a bar chiyuva. He's miyuchas, straight from 17 different gedolei hadar. He's definitely mechuyev in the mitzvah. Is the oilam yotzei or not yotzei? You hear from a misasek. He was not mechavein to produce a sound. Yotzei or not?
You can say
Not
Not yotzei.
a halachic sound.
So you say, okay. So you have to say that since, that's what Chazon Ish continues in number 19, that if someone is misasek, even though it's the same noise and the same sound, it's not a halachic sound. But this is where it gets impossible. What's the halach if a guy comes into the shul before davening, and the chveis, he has to leave early, he's going, whatever, he has to go places. He doesn't have patience to sit around for a longer davening, and he blows the shofar, and he's blowing the shofar for himself, and he doesn't have kavanah for anybody else. And the oilam happens to be there, and the oilam hears the tkiyah shofar. Is the oilam yotzei? Is the oilam not yotzei? No, that's another mishnah, that whoever blows have to be mechavein to be motzei the tzibur. Why in the world would the Baal Tokeya have to be mechavein to be motzei the tzibur? He's a bar chiyuva. He's blowing the sound of a mitzvah. What's missing? I have to be mechavein to be motzei you? I'm not being motzei you. You're being yotzei yourself. Imagine if I built a sukkah and I wasn't mechavein to build it for you. Are you yotzei if you sit in the sukkah? Of course you're yotzei. Why in the world would I have to be mechavein to be motzei you? I'm not being motzei you. So what's the pshat in the halacha that I need to be mechavein to be motzei you in the mitzvah of shofar? I'm not being motzei you. You're being motzei yourself. The whole mitzvah is just to hear it. To walk into a shul where there's a sound floating and to chap it in your eardrum. So what's pshat in the halacha? That you need to be mechavein to be moitzi somebody in tkiyah shofar. It's like there's no way out of that question. The Shagas Aryeh would say very pashat. Well, the Shagas Aryeh say there are two parts of the mitzvah of shofar. There's a mitzvah to hear, and there's a mitzvah to blow. And if you're going to blow for me, you have to be mechavein to be moitzi me. But the Rambam doesn't hold that way. The Rambam holds the mitzvah to listen. He only said it 8 times. So the mitzvah is to listen. Why does the halacha require that the Baal Tokeya be mechavein to be motzei the shemeya? So you want to hear Gavaldig Lamdas? This is amazing Lamdas. Yeah.
Going back, but the Shagas Aryeh, if there's a thing on the mice at as well, how can you get other people? What have you out of that? Like a tefillin, I can't put on for you.
That's a good kasha. Taka is a good
Well,
kasha.
that's it.
I mean, if you learn the mitzvah is to blow, how could I blow for you? Mitzvah shebegufa, you can't. It's a valid question. It's an excellent question. But it's not a kasha on them, Yeah, it's a zaytig azach. Lamaisa, at the end of the year, we're going to have an amazing answer for that. Okay, but I would say at this point in the year, put it aside, chalk it up as a good question. I used to think that an answer was that, you ever wonder, tkiyah shofar, what do they daven here? Nusach Ashkenaz, Nusach Sfard? Ashkenaz. Okay, very good. What? Anyway, but by Nusach Sfard, they blow shofar in the middle of Chazar Sashatz. What in the world do they do in the middle of Chazar Sashatz? And it's the guy take out a lulav and esrog, start shaking in the middle of Chazar. They blow in the middle of the Shtil Shman Esrei. Imagine in the middle of Shtil Shman Esrei, a guy takes out his lulav and esrog, starts shaking it. A guy, I don't know, a tzedakah collector comes. You give tzedakah in the middle of Shman Esrei? You don't do mitzvahs in the middle of Shman Esrei. What are you blowing shofar in the middle of Shman Esrei? So there's a concept that Tkei Shofar is tefillah. So the one thing I could do for you is I could daven for you, because Shemea Ka'ina. So if you learn that Tkei Shofar is it's like a tefillah without the mivtas vasayim. It's called the tefillah meyomka deliba. There's a concept that Tkei Shofar is a form of tefillah. I could be moitzi you in tefillah. Shemea Ka'ina. But we're going to have a better answer, okay? Okay, this answer I heard from many Makairos, many sources. The Avnei Nezer says this. There's a sefer from Rav Ruderman, Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael. He says it, and he says it in the name of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Usually, when you hear Rabbi Yisrael Salanter Elul time, you start getting scared and you get musar. So imagine, I came here to tell you Rabbi Yisrael Salanter Lamdas. There are not so many Lamdas from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter that we have. He says, really a fantastic idea. There's a mitzvah in the Torah, the 613th mitzvah is Ksiva Sefer Torah. Yeah? Now, people who write a Sefer Torah, they think that when they write the Sefer Torah, they're going to make a shtar that it doesn't belong to the shul. And they think they're doing that so that one day they could get the Sefer Torah back. Little do they know that if they don't do that, and they give the Sefer Torah to the shul, you are not mekayim the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah. Because there is no mitzvah in the Torah to write a Sefer Torah. The mitzvah is to own a Sefer Torah. And if you give it to a shul, you've lost the mitzvah. You know that? People make this whole ceremony, Hachnasa Sefer Torah. That's the ceremony of losing the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah. I don't know what the big ceremony is. It's sad. It's like so that's why you better write a shtar that you're not giving it to the shul. The moment you let the shul have it, you've lost the mitzvah. It's halacha. There's nobody argues about that. There is no fine. So what do we learn from here? If you write a sefer Torah and you give it to your friend, lo yatsa, lo yatsa. So what's halacha if you inherit a Sefer Torah? So, the mitzvah is to own it, so I inherited it. Am I yotzei? I'm also not yotzei. So the mitzvah is to write it. So if I wrote it and gave it to Jai, it should be yotzei. So which one is it? If the mitzvah is to write it, why can't I give it to the shul? If the mitzvah is to own it, why can't I inherit it? What about if I buy a Sefer Torah from a sofer? So I owned it, but I didn't even write it. I'm yotzei. Why? Because I did a maisa. So what's going on over here? Is the mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah or is the mitzvah to own a Sefer Torah? We're going to learn an amazing thing. I never knew this, I never understood this, but this is, Mamish opens up Kol Torah Kula. Every mitzvah has two parts to it, but most of the time the two parts happen simultaneously. Occasionally you could strip them apart and see that they're two different aspects. Every mitzvah has a maisa, and every mitzvah has a fulfillment and a kiyum. Most of the time it's exactly the same thing. It's wearing tefillin. The maisa mitzvah is to put on the tefillin. The fulfillment is to wear the tefillin. Tzitzis. The maisa is to put on the tzitzis. The kiyum is to be wearing the tzitzis. Occasionally you could split the two. Simchas Yom Tov. There's a mitzvah to eat meat on Yom Tov. What's the mitzvah? The maisa mitzvah is to take basar, take a good piece of steak, and chew it. Is that the kiyum ha-mitzvah? No, the kiyum ha-mitzvah is to be in a state of simcha. Well, what if I take a artificial way of making myself happy, and I get to an even better place than by chewing that basar? No, I don't get the mitzvah. I have to do a maisa mitzvah of eating basar, What if I chew on meat and I'm not happy? So you probably don't get the mitzvah either. The Ma'isa mitzvah is eating the meat, and the fulfillment of the mitzvah is being in a state of simcha, avelos. The Ma'isa avelos there's certain restrictions of guidelines of behavior. I need to sit in a certain place. I need to rip certain things. But that's the Ma'isa. The Kiyum is a state of mourning. And now let's talk about Sefer Torah. The mitzvah of Sefer Torah, the way I fulfill the mitzvah is by owning the Sefer Torah. But I could only fulfill the mitzvah if it comes al yedei the Ma'isa mitzvah of Ksiva. If I inherit it, I don't get the mitzvah. If I buy it, I did a Ma'isa. If I commissioned the Shofar, I did a Ma'isa. The Kiyum HaMitzvah is ownership. The Ma'isa mitzvah is writing. Now I'm going to tell you a very important yesod. You are allowed to do maisim for people, but you can never fulfill a mitzvah for somebody. You could be a shliach to do a maisa for somebody. You cannot be a shliach to get credit for somebody. So I could technically do the maisa of wearing tefillin for you. The problem is, I can't get credit for the fulfillment of tefillin for you. I could do the maisa of tzitzis for you. I can't get credit for the fulfillment of tzitzis. But sometimes the Maisa and the fulfillment happen at different intervals. We could strip it, like by Ksiva Sefer Torah. What's the Kiyum HaMitzvah? Owning it. But I have to do a Maisa. So that's why I can have the Shofar write it for me. What do you mean? You can't have a Mitzvah Shebegufay, have someone else do it for you. The answer is, he's not being Mekayim the Mitzvah for me, he's doing the Maisa for me. He's doing the act of writing for me. So the Shofar could do the act of writing for me, and I will fulfill it when I own it. If the mitzvah, and if the Maisa mitzvah was ownership, then I would have to do everything myself. The Maisa mitzvah is the writing, the Kiyum HaMitzvah is the ownership. Maisim people could do for me, fulfillments people cannot do for me. So let's talk about Tkiyah Shofar. Says the Avnei Nezer, says Rav Soloveitchik says this, says Rav Ruderman, says Rabbi Salanter, the mitzvah of Shofar is an amazing mitzvah, it's a unique mitzvah. The Kiyum HaMitzvah is when you bring your eardrum to the shul and you hear the Shofar. And what's the Ma'isa HaMitzvah? The Ma'isa HaMitzvah is blowing it. If the Kiyum HaMitzvah was blowing it, you couldn't blow for me. But there's no Kiyum HaMitzvah by blowing. The Kiyum HaMitzvah is by listening. The Ma'isa HaMitzvah is blowing. You could blow for me. The Baal Tokeya is the Baal Tokeya being Moitzi the Tzibor. He's being Moitzi the Tzibor in the Ma'isa HaMitzvah. But in the Kiyum HaMitzvah, everybody does on their own. The Rambam is correct. There is no mitzvah in the Torah to blow shofar. There's no such mitzvah. The mitzvah is to hear the sound of the shofar. But the mitzvah has to come through the Ma'isa mitzvah of Tkiyah. So therefore, the Baal Tekeh is being moitzi the tzibur in the Ma'isa mitzvah of Tkiyah. So the Baal Tekeh cannot be a cherei shoyt v'katan. Furthermore, if he wants to transfer that Ma'isa mitzvah to the listeners, he has to be mechavein to transfer it to the listeners. He can't be a masasek and he can't be thoughtless.
What's the Ma'isa mitzvah by sukkah?
It's simultaneous, sitting in the sukkah, yeshiva. That's why a cherei shoyt v'katan could build a sukkah. That's why you could build a sukkah without any kavanah whatsoever. But the mitzvah of shofar is a unique mitzvah. It's analogous to...
Somebody was sitting somewhere and somebody built a sukkah around him, and then sukkahs came. Is he yaitza? There was no Ma'isa, because he never did a Ma'isa yeshiva, just a kiyum.
It could be the Ma'isa is being in a sukkah. I mean, that's not a Ma'isa.
We're not separating now the Ma'isa and the kiyum.
That's a different question. Is he mechavein to sit in the sukkah when...
Yeah, but he sat there in Yom Kippur, and then after Yom Kippur somebody built the sukkah around him.
But he could leave, so his lack of leaving... Yeah, like by shatnez. You get malchus for wearing shatnez. Why?
You have to put it on. If somebody puts it on you and you don't take it off,
Yeah, you get malchus, because you didn't take it off. No?
Marcus, yeah, come on, Marcus.
Yeah. In other words, your non-removal is considered a
With an
Maisa.
oral, the lack of Maisa is the Avera, but it doesn't. In the Lomdus that we're handling now, we haven't said that in that situation there was a Maisa.
That's a different. It's almost a different question. Is that considered an act? Am I
not leaving the sukkah or having the.
But I don't know if that's. I don't know. Is that important to this? Do we need to say whether he is over or not? The point is, yeshiva b'sukkah, the kiyum and the maisa are simultaneous, are the same, are happening at the same time. By shofar, it's not. We could separate the maisa from the kiyum. The maisa is the blowing, and the kiyum is the listening. By sukkah, it's all the same. The maisa and the kiyum is sitting in the sukkah. So it comes out that the. It's not like the chazonish avada.
Why not? You read Lashon Magnitude, just said.
Yeah.
Any mitzvah has to be kosher mitzvah because it's part of the Maisa.
I don't know. He doesn't.
It's only very briefly.
He doesn't. Yeah, maybe. It's generally not. Maybe.
Okay, going back to the other Rishonim.
Yeah.
That hold that it's kiyum.
Oh, so 1 second. Yeah.
You run into big trouble because they're going to hold that the kiyum mitzvah. Is
Again, 1 second. The other Rishonim, it's impossible to say the mitzvah is just to blow because mitzvah, we know you need to hear from the other Mishnayos, from all the Mishnayos. So basically, what we're doing now is we're making Shema Yisrael. Everybody agrees that the Maisa mitzvah is to blow, even the Rambam. Everybody agrees the Kiyam mitzvah is to listen, even the Baha, even the Smag, and the Sheltis. So what do they argue on? They argue on when Chazal formulate a lashon and a nusach of a bracha, is the nusach habracha made based on the Maisa mitzvah, or is the nusach habracha made based on the fulfillment of the mitzvah? Now the truth is, usually we say brachas are based on the Maisa mitzvah, not the Kiyam mitzvah. For example, let's go to Sfiras HaOmer for a minute. This is a brisker Rav. That we know there's a shita of the Bahag that we're choishesh for, that the mitzvah of Sfiras is one long mitzvah, and that's why if you miss a night, you're up the creek without a paddle. But the Rishonim ask on the Bahag, if in fact Sfiras HaOmer is one long mitzvah, then why in the world would we make a bracha every single night? Ashar Kedeshanu Mitzvahs V'Tzivanu Al Sfiras HaOmer every night. If it's one long mitzvah, we should make one bracha in the beginning, and that should cover all 49 days. Doesn't the fact that we make a bracha every single night indicate that each night is a separate mitzvah? That's a kasha on the Bahag. The Bahag learns Sfira is one long mitzvah, so why do we make a bracha every day? Says the brisker Rav, Avada, it's one long mitzvah. That means it's one long kiyum ha-mitzvah. At the end of the day, you fulfilled one mitzvah. But the one mitzvah you fulfilled is through 49 maisim. Everybody agrees, even the Bahag agrees, that even though it's one mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah that's fulfilled with 49 maisim. By counting day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. So if it's 49 maisim, we don't make brachos on kiyumim. We make brachos on actions. So even the Bahag would agree, we make a bracha every single night. Because we don't make blessings on the fulfillment of a mitzvah, we make blessings on the act that is used to fulfill it. So it's like this. Really now, the Shiltis should be correct, and Rabbeinu Tam should be correct. That everybody agrees the mitzvah of Shofar is the Kiyam HaMitzvah of listening. But we usually formulate brachos based on the Maisa HaMitzvah. And that's why they say you should make the bracha L'tkaya. So what does the Rambam hold? The Rambam says like this. The Rambam would hold that even though we usually make brachos based on the Masim, that's only when the Maisa and the Kiyam happen at different times. But if they happen simultaneously, then Chazal will formulate the bracha on the Kiyam HaMitzvah. So how do we know Rabbi Yisrael Salanter holds this way? So in Rabbi Ruderman's Sefer, he brings down a wonderful thing. He says that in the shul of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, he would be machriz every Rosh Hashanah that for Tkiyah Shofar, everyone should have 2 kavanos. Kavana number 1, to mekayim the mitzvah of listening to the shofar. And kavana number 2, to be yotzei the Maisa Mitzvah with the Baal Toikeya. That's exactly this lamdas. And it comes out Lamaisa, it's probably the correct thing to have these two kavanos. In other words, is what is the Baal Toikeya doing? We've elevated, we brought you back, we made you important again. Right? Because in the Rambam, until now, you're the guy with the hammer building the sukkah. But if you're a guy with a hammer, anyone could build the sukkah. So no, it's more than that. You're not being moitzi people with the kiyum mitzvah, but you're being moitzi them with the maisa mitzvah. Yeah?
We say lo niach tefillin, not hanachat al hanachat tefillin.
Even though what, it's simultaneous to the kiyum?
Yeah.
Right, that's true.
We say al mitzvahs tefillin when we're doing shorosh.
I know. By the way, with brachos, it's very, very.
Lots of rules.
Yeah, the Rosh Psachim gives the rule. When do you do al? When do you do le? And that's a tremendous sugya. And it never found every bracha is an exception to the rule.
What about the din of Gezer?
Oh, that was my last point. Excellent. So now the question is, Bishlama, if you learn the Rambam Kipshutai, that everything is listening and blowing is a hechsher mitzvah, we understand why the Rambam holds that if you steal the shofar, you're yotzei the mitzvah. Because blowing is just a hechsher mitzvah. But now blowing is not a hechsher mitzvah anymore. Blowing is the maisa mitzvah. So Rabbi Rucham Moshe, Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood, has in his sefer that according to this Torah, which by the way is now, Reb Chaim Brisker also says this. So this Reb Chaim Brisker, the Avnei Nezer, Rabbi Shal Salanter, Reb Ruderman, that it would come out, and he says it is considered legitimate to say that the din of mitzvah haba ba'avera is only on the kiyum ha-mitzvah. You can't be mekayim a mitzvah with a stolen thing, but a maisa mitzvah, the Rambam holds you could do with something which is stolen. There's no din of mitzvah haba ba'avera on the maisa mitzvah, only on the kiyum ha-mitzvah. So this approach would be saying that the Rishonim don't really argue, meaning the Shagas Aryeh says, what's shofar? It's 2 parts. But it's very, very difficult to say such a thing, that there are 2 parts. So this Lamdas is saying that there's no machlokes in the Rishonim. Everybody agrees the Maisa mitzvah is Tkiyah shofar, the Kiyum mitzvah is Shmiyas ha-shofar, similar to Ksiva Sefer Torah, where the Maisa is the Ksiva and the Kiyum is the ownership. And that's why you need a bar chiyuva, that's why you need kavana, not to transfer the kiyum, but to transfer the maisa, which anyway, like you pointed out, is shver on the other rishonim. That if the kiyum ha-mitzvah is the blowing, how could you do it for somebody else? So we're suggesting that it's not the kiyum ha-mitzvah, it's only the maisa mitzvah. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight, and look forward to being here the next couple of days. Shkoyach. And let me be the first to wish you Aksivach Simataiva.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.